I saw this video last night and it hit me. This was someone's actual reality. I mean, imagine your son going missing in a short amount of time on his paper route. He never comes home, and then his wagon is found just 2 blocks away from his house, still filled with the newspapers that he was supposed to be delivering that morning. In a matter of moments, he's gone. And then just when all hope is lost, 14 years later, he shows back up on your front doorstep telling you some really horrific things that happened since his abduction. Then he disappears into the night once again. This is the disturbing disappearance of Johnny Gosch, which is still unsolved to this day. But since there is a slight chance that he could still be out there somewhere alive, let's talk about it. This is Johnny Gosch. He was only 12 years old when he mysteriously disappeared in 1982. He lived in Des Moines, Iowa with his mom Noreen and his dad John. Johnny was described as your typical innocent 12-year-old little boy who was a really hard worker. At the time of his disappearance, he was trying to save up for a brand new dirt bike. So being a hard worker, Johnny signed up to become a paper boy for the Des Moines Register. He had his usual route around his West Des Moines neighborhood, and he was really good at delivering the newspapers on time. He was a super reliable little kid. Normally, Johnny would wake his dad up before dawn and the two would begin delivering newspapers. It was a fun thing the two of them did together, and it was a really good bonding experience. But on the morning of September 5th, 1982, this would all change, and tragedy would strike the Gosch family. So just before dawn, Johnny woke up to start getting ready for his job. Like I said, his dad would usually come with, but that morning, for whatever reason, Johnny decided to let his dad sleep in. Instead, he left the house with only the family's pet dog, Gretchen, who was a miniature dachshund. Just before 6 that morning, other paper carriers saw Johnny and Gretchen at the paper drop picking up his stack of newspapers. At this point, all seems normal, but not long after, this is where things start to get really disturbing. So shortly after Johnny picked up his papers, another paper boy named Mike saw him talking to a stocky man in a blue two-toned car near the paper drop. Mike wasn't the only one who saw this either. So another paper boy named John Rossi also saw the man in the blue two-toned car talking to Johnny. He distinctly remembered this because he felt deep down in the pit of his stomach that something just felt really strange about it. Then Johnny comes up to the other paperboy John and tells him that the stocky man in the blue car said he was lost and asking for directions, which Johnny didn't know how to give. So he was hoping John may be able to step in and help. John did, and he even remembers for whatever reason looking directly at this man's license plate. But after this interaction, the man sped off. After this, Johnny was seen walking a block north where his paper route began, and he was seen by yet another paperboy who noticed something strange. As Johnny was walking with his dog in a wagon filled with newspapers, this other paperboy noticed that he was being followed by another man, not the one in the blue car. So now at this point, you have several witnesses who say they saw Johnny being scouted and followed by these unknown men. No one knew it at the time, but Johnny would disappear after this, and these sightings would go on to play a huge role in this case. So fast forward to later that morning. It's now well into the morning when Johnny should have been home by now, but his parents wake up to something odd. They started receiving multiple calls from angry customers along Johnny's route, saying he never delivered their paper that morning. This was super confusing and really unlike Johnny, so this was an immediate red flag to his family. So they got up to start looking for him in the house, but he wasn't there. What they did find, though, sent chills down their spine. Literally shaking and trembling in their front yard was their pet dog Gretchen, who seemed traumatized. But Johnny wasn't with her, so they knew something horrible must have happened to him. Johnny's dad immediately began searching along his route, and just 2 blocks from the family's home, they found something incredibly disturbing. There, laying on the side of the street, was Johnny's wagon, still filled with the newspapers that he was supposed to be delivering that morning. This is when his family reported him missing, or I guess I should say, tried reporting him missing. Police took their sweet time arriving to the scene. It took them 45 minutes just to show up, and when they did, they completely dismissed his parents. They tried saying that Johnny was probably just a runaway, and that they couldn't even report him missing for 72 hours, which is not true, by the way. That's actually insane to me because he was a literal child, and his dog was shaking, which should be their first clue that something bad happened. Anyways, 3 days come and go, and by then, the police start to change their minds about the case. I mean, Johnny was still nowhere to be found, and when they finally started their investigation, things were really not looking good. All of the witnesses who saw Johnny the morning he disappeared came forward and gave their statements. They told them all all about the stocky man in the blue two-toned car, which police were able to create a composite sketch from. But for some reason, police refused to release this sketch to the public, even though this was an active investigation where time was of the essence. So again, this was another slap in the face to the Gosch family. This led the family to hire a PI to create their own sketches of this man, which were then released to the public. That's who you're seeing here. The other paperboy, John, told authorities in great detail how he talked to this man, and he even remembered looking at his license plate because he just felt like something was off. But sadly, at this point, he couldn't remember the license plate number. As the days went on and Johnny was still missing, this ate at the paperboy. He said he kept hoping that he would randomly wake up in the middle of the night and remember the license plate number, but he never did. He even underwent hypnosis to try and figure this out, but sadly, he only ever remembered a few numbers, and that the license plate was from Warren County. Then, another shocking discovery would be made. So one of Johnny's neighbors who was along his route reported hearing a car door slam the morning that Johnny disappeared. This startled him because it was super early, and there shouldn't be any reason for someone to be that loud. So he looked out of his window, and then he saw a silver Ford Fairmont speed away north. What's crazy is that this sighting took place at the exact same spot where Johnny's wagon was eventually found. So this was a huge lead, and all of this information was eventually released to the public. Despite many extensive searches, the owners of these two cars were never found. No one ever came forward, and if they were ever actually connected to Johnny's disappearance or not, we just don't know for sure. There were so many searches for Johnny, but besides his wagon that was left behind, it was like he disappeared without a trace. But just a few months after his disappearance, Johnny was spotted all the way in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A woman was outside when a little boy started yelling at her for help, but he was quickly dragged off by two men. This woman swears up and down that this was Johnny, but police were never able to track him or those two men down to confirm. Then, 2 years after Johnny disappeared, more little boys would continue to go missing, and the most disturbing part is that they were also paper boys. One was even a paper boy for the same company that Johnny worked for, the Des Moines Register. So on August 12, 1984, 13-year-old Eugene Martin disappeared while delivering papers for the Des Moines Register on the city's south side. This sparked renewed interest in Johnny's case because of how creepy and similar the two cases were. Then, just a year after that, another paperboy mysteriously disappeared. His name was Mark James Warren Allen, and he was also 13 years old when he disappeared in Des Moines, Iowa on March 29, 1986. That day, Mark was not on his paper route, but he was walking just down the street from his own home to a friend's house. He never made it, and just like the other two cases, his whereabouts remain unknown. Some sources say that Mark wasn't actually a paperboy, but his brother did confirm that he really was. But like I said, he just wasn't on his route that day. Police have never officially linked these three cases together due to lack of evidence, but the similarities are just too creepy to ignore. What's super disturbing though is that when all of these other little boys started going missing, and when police announced that they couldn't officially connect them, Johnny's mom Noreen said otherwise. Noreen said that after Johnny's disappearance, she hired a PI because she didn't fully trust the police. And this PI told Noreen that he was actually informed of the Eugene abduction a few months before it actually took place. I guess as this PI dug deeper into Johnny's case, an anonymous tipster told him that another kidnapping would take place on the second weekend in August 1984, and it would be a paperboy just like Johnny, and this paperboy would be taken from the south side of Des Moines. Now, this tipster didn't specifically mention Eugene's name, but this was incredibly alarming. I'm not sure if this information was ever turned into police, but I mean, I can assume that it was. But this was bizarre, and it definitely makes me wonder if these three disappearances were actually connected. That maybe a predator in Des Moines was stalking these neighborhoods, specifically targeting paperboys. Like I said, police have never confirmed this, but it all just lines up too perfectly. These three disappearances from the same neighborhoods would go on to spark a major movement, which we've all seen before, or at the very least have heard about before. Do you remember in the 80s when missing kids began being featured on milk cartons? Well, Johnny and Eugene's case inspired this movement, and they were some of the first missing kids to ever be featured on a milk carton. Missing children were featured on milk cartons in the 1980s as a public service to raise awareness and seek leads, working as a campaign to find missing kids. This eventually stopped because the campaign had a low recovery rate, and it was rendered obsolete by the creation of the Amber Alert system in 1996. On top of this, I guess these images were really only seen by little kids at the breakfast table, and instilled a fear that was only proving to be harmful. So as the years went on, Johnny's case would fall cold. His family would receive cruel hoax letters from people saying they know where Johnny is, and if they paid them enough, they would bring him home. One person in particular who did this was a man named Robert Meyer. Robert told the Gosch family that Johnny was taken as part of a large child slavery ring in Mexico City, and the family actually paid him $11,000 because he promised to bring Johnny home. The FBI eventually stepped in and proved that he was lying, and Robert was eventually charged with wire fraud. But the Gosch family, specifically Noreen, believes that he was telling the truth, that Johnny was taken by a predator and sold into a sex trafficking ring. 14 years later, now 1997, something would happen that would thrust this case back into the spotlight. And it gives me chills to even think about this happening, so just be warned. So in 1997, Noreen was woken up at 2:30 in the morning from a knock on her door. At this point, she had divorced Johnny's dad and was living on her own in a new apartment. When she slowly opened the door, standing in front of her was Johnny. According to Noreen, he was now 27 years old, and although his hair was now long and dyed black, she said she recognized her son immediately. Johnny then lifted up his shirt to reveal a birthmark that little Johnny definitely had. He was standing next to an unidentified man, and he didn't speak unless he looked over to this man for approval. But Noreen talked with Johnny for over an hour, and he detailed all of the horrible things that had happened to him since his abduction. He told his mom that once he was kidnapped, he was sold into a sex trafficking ring and endured horrific abuse. He refused to tell Noreen where he was living or where he was going after, but he said that he was cast aside from his kidnappers once he got too old. He then escaped and had been living under a secret identity ever since because going back to his old life was dangerous. Johnny said that he could identify all of his kidnappers, so that made him a target. Therefore, he had to go into hiding. Then after their conversation, Johnny and this unknown man slipped away into the darkness, never to be seen again. Noreen recounted all of this on her website if you want a deeper explanation, but she is 100% certain that this was the real Johnny. So Noreen took all of this information to the FBI, who even created a composite sketch of what Johnny would look like now at 27 years old. Noreen went on to write a book not only about this encounter, but also about her life after losing Johnny. It's called Why Johnny Can't Come Home. Sadly, this case would once again fall cold. That is until 2006. On September 1st, 2006, so now 24 years after Johnny disappeared, Noreen woke up to find unmarked envelopes sitting on her front porch. When she opened them, she found really disturbing photographs of little boys who were bound and gagged. 3 of the little boys in those photos ended up eventually being identified, and it was an unrelated photo that, according to police, was just a prank between the boys and wasn't criminal in nature. Another photo shows what appears to be a deceased man with something tied around his neck, and the last photo shows a still unidentified little boy, around the same age as Johnny when he disappeared. The little boy had his mouth gagged, his hands and feet were tied, and he had a human brand on his shoulder. Noreen is adamant that this little boy in the photo was Johnny. Authorities have never been able to identify who this little boy actually was, so in all reality, this could really have been Johnny. All we know is that Noreen wasn't the only one to receive these photos. On the same day she awoke to find them, others connected to his case also received them by either email or mail. So even if some of them didn't turn out to be connected, it's still incredibly creepy. What's really horrifying about this case is that nobody knows what really happened to Johnny that day, but one major theory is super prevalent, that he was kidnapped and sold into a sex trafficking ring. And one person that really backs this up is a man named Paul Benacki. So after Johnny's disappearance, 21-year-old Paul came forward and said that he had been abducted and forced into a sex ring when he was a kid, and then he was forced to help kidnap Johnny, who then was forced into that same ring. Now, a lot of people, even the FBI, don't believe this man. He was known to be somewhat of a con artist and just inserted himself way too much into this case. But Noreen, on the other hand, believes him. Noreen actually met with Paul, and according to her, he told her things that he would only have known had he spent time with Johnny. He described scars on his body that had never been released to the public, and he also mentioned a stammer that Johnny had when he was upset, which again was not common information. So this was some pretty damning information, but like I said, the police just don't believe him. I guess his siblings came forward and said that he was never kidnapped, and that he was at home at the time of Johnny's disappearance. So whether or not he was telling the truth, we don't know for sure. He said that Johnny had visited him several times, but he was never able to give police his location. As of today, Johnny has never been found, and although his case remains open, it has long since been frozen cold. But over the years, there have been a few theories as to what could have happened to him. The main theory is that he was kidnapped and was a victim of foul play, but whether that was by a single predator who just randomly saw him and decided to strike, or by a serial killer targeting young boys just like Johnny, Eugene, and Mark, or lastly, if Johnny really was kidnapped by a sexual predator and then forced into a trafficking ring. It's not a question of whether or not he was abducted, it's just by who and why. One thing that really confuses me is if it was really him that came back to visit his mom in 1997. A lot of people don't believe Noreen when she says this happened, even some of the Gosh family. Some suspect that the visit did actually happen, but that it wasn't the real Johnny, that it was some sick individual pretending to be him. Some people suspect that she could have been dreaming, or maybe just subconsciously made it up over the grief of losing her son. I don't blame her if that's the case, because can you imagine losing your child like this and then just never having any answers? It's devastating. And more than that, Noreen has just never had an easy life. It all started in 1960 when a massive tornado came through and completely destroyed her house in eastern Iowa. At that point in time, Noreen was married to a different man long before Johnny was born, but she did have 2 other kids from that marriage. When the tornado passed, she walked outside and saw her 2 kids laying face down in the gravel and glass. She thought they were dead, but luckily everyone in her family survived. Sadly though, her then husband was battling cancer, and just 2 months after this devastating tornado, he passed away, leaving her a young widow. She eventually remarried to John Gosh and had Johnny in 1969, but just 13 years later, as we know, Johnny would go missing, and his case would go on to become one of the most high-profile child disappearances ever. So when I say that she has not had an easy life, I mean it. Nonetheless, she's never let anything stop her from trying to find her son. Noreen started the Johnny Gosh Foundation, where she would visit schools and teach kids the MOs that sexual predators use. She also advocated for the Johnny Gosh Bill, which mandates an immediate police response to reports of missing children, something that never happened with Johnny's case. This bill was actually passed into law in Iowa in 1984, so she has never stopped searching for her son and trying to make change to ensure that what happened to him never happens again. So here we are, 44 years later, the case still unsolved, and whatever happened to Johnny that morning, and whether or not he is still alive, remains a mystery.